Hey, y'all. Hey. Okay, so it's Sunday afternoon, evening. You could be anywhere in the world, and you've chosen to be here with us. So we hope that you get very comfortable. It's a whole lot of wings, macaroni and cheese, and greens in the back, as Sean already mentioned. So you should get them. And I hope it feels like you're in your auntie's living room. Anybody got a cool old auntie? Y'all know who I'm talking about? Listen, this is very call and response. My facilitation style is like the black church. Anybody got a cool auntie? Yes. Okay. Does it feel like your cool auntie's living room? It's given. Okay, just gotta make sure, because we don't want y'all to be leaving talking about you ain't eating enough or it was uncomfortable or any of those sorts of things. You feel good? Okay, good. I just want to make sure. You know how we are. So seriously, I am over the moon. I don't get nervous very often. Not really nervous, but I am so honored and I feel so humbled to have Donovan X Ramsey at the ThirdSpace's reading room this evening. I don't know. I was going to make something up, but I'm just going to admit I don't know how I found out about When Crack Was King. It might have been like Amazon or Audible or something recommended it. But whatever it was, as soon as I saw it, I was like, purchase. And then as soon as the pre-order arrived, it was like, whatever I'm reading, I'm going to stop reading that and start this. And that was the absolute right decision, because this isn't the most important book I've ever read, but it's really, really high up there. And I'll be reading, y'all. Like, I'm on my 45th book for the year. I'm a little behind. But as a kid born in 1984 in Youngstown, Ohio, there had not been anything that was out there that spoke to my experience growing up in a crack-ravaged neighborhood, community, city, country. And so you have really done us an incredible service, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with you. So with that, can we give Donovan a round of applause just for this very, very important work. So this was a tough preparation, as you can see. Donovan said, "Oh, that's more than what I had," and I don't believe that.
My book does not look like that.
He says his book don't look like this. I don't know, but there was really just so much. So we always want you all to read any book that is a part of any author talk, but this one is like for real, for real, for real, for real. If you are between the ages of, 25 and 75, if you grew up in any urban center or really adjacent to any urban center in America, this book is a highly recommended read for me. So we're going to start with a soul check, because at ThirdSpace's Action Lab we have a practice of, no matter what room we're in or what conversation we're having or who we're having that conversation with, we think it's really important to check in on the soul. These are not icebreakers. Not trying to get to know each other in that kind of way. It really is an opportunity to check in on where we're at, especially considering a lot of the conversations that we are having are hard ones. This is not an easy topic, especially for those of us that have lived through this topic. So we're going to start with a soul check, and then I was hoping you could open us with a read. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. So the soul check is, if your soul was a piece of art today, to describe, like, if we were describing your soul as a piece of art, what piece of art would it be and why? It could be any form of art, but what would it be and why?
I almost feel like it would be architecture.
Okay.
Because it feels very solid and something that I've tried to build over time.
Yeah.
That hopefully is still beautiful and open, but there's some security. There's some, there's a fence, there's a gate, but also some openings and hopefully some beauty to it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What about you?
I would say my soul today is Aretha Franklin's. It's usually Aretha. Aretha Franklin's "Ain't No Way." Anybody hip? Any Aretha Franklin? Okay.
Absolutely.
So you know how she get the singing and Ain't No Way. And I think it's just, this is always a tough time of year for me professionally. It's like the time of year that we're trying to do all the things we didn't get to all year so we can get to our new year, new me. And it just feels like chaotic and crazy. And Ain't No Way is this, I think, plea to, in that case, a lover. But for me, it feels like a plea to all of us that we can't kind of continue the way that we are if we want to kind of be true to ourselves. I was about to get crazy with the metaphor, but that's where my soul is at today. So I have so many questions, and I'm not going to get to all of them because we want to leave space and time for questions from you all, but also, depending on where y'all at and how y'all feeling, we might want to do a little writing exercise because we have such a prolific writer with us today. So I'm going to try to be disciplined, although I feel a little selfish that I want to get to all of my stuff. But to give you all a preview, especially for folks that haven't had an opportunity to read yet, I was hoping you could start with something for us.
All right, y'all. So I don't often read from the book, but this is something that actually I was reading back the introduction today. And I think maybe because I'm back home in Ohio, it's not Columbus, but so much of this landscape just reminds me of the neighborhood that I grew up in and, the houses, the streets, the weather. So I wanted to read from the introduction, which is a little bit about how I came to this subject matter and about my upbringing. I hardly ever saw Michelle, despite the fact that she lived just a few doors down the block from my family. I don't remember meeting her, but I learned to be afraid of her. My mom, a cautious woman who otherwise avoided gossip, would drag our house phone from room to room by its long light cord and talk at length to her friends about Michelle from down the street. Michelle had too many strange people going in and out of her house. The neighborhood could hear her parties at all hours of the night, my mom complained. She looked, quote, a mess. It was all just so sad, my mom would say with a slow shake of her head. The phone conversations would drift to other topics, but I stayed fixed on Michelle and tried to imagine what might be going on just a few feet away. One Sunday afternoon, I was sitting on our front porch with my older sister when a van pulled up and parked in front of Michelle's place. Out of it came an older woman and a young girl, each resembling our infamous neighbor in her own way. Because my sister knew everything, I asked her who the strangers were. Duh, that's Michelle's family, she said. The small girl was Michelle's daughter. Why don't she live with her mom, I asked. My sister shrugged her shoulders, dismissive, then answered, I don't know, probably because Michelle was a crackhead. It was 1993 or 1994 in Columbus, Ohio. I was just 5 or 6 years old, but I had heard the word crackhead countless times, usually from other kids. Crackhead was a go-to insult. So-and-so was acting like a crackhead. Your mama was a crackhead. The word was popular, I assume, because it belonged to the grown-up world, and using it made us feel grown. I suppose we made it a slur because we feared what it represented, a rock bottom to which any of us could sink. That's what children do when they're in search of power over things that frighten us. We reduce them to words, bite-sized things that can be spat out at a moment's notice. Still, I couldn't make sense of the fact that Michelle was a crackhead. She lived just down the street after all, and she had a family. Crackheads were supposed to be foreigners from some netherworld, whose main activity was begging for money and otherwise disrupting community life. Then they were supposed to return to wherever they came from, alleyways, sewers, wherever the trash went after we threw it out. I remember Michelle disappearing from the neighborhood sometime soon after that visit from her family. She was replaced in my awareness by other people who lived on the margins of our poor black community. There was the thin, light-skinned woman I'd see sometimes around the convenience store at the end of our street. Al, the older man who owned and operated the store, called her Miss Prissy, after the skinny, frenetic chicken from the Foghorn Leghorn cartoons. There was a man whose name I never knew, who walked up and down the streets, always in a hurry and always selling something. bags of loose fireworks in the summer, brand new down coats in the winter. As with Michelle, the adults I knew acknowledged him and Prissy only in passing. I did the math and concluded they were also crackheads. That type of calculus, I imagine, was common for lots of kids who grew up like me, poor and black in the midst of the crack epidemic of the 80s and 90s. There were things happening all around us that we knew better than to ask about, things we had to figure out for ourselves. My mother had a policy, mind your business. That's exactly what she said when she catch me stealing glances at the older boys on the corner, mind your business. It was like growing up in a steel town where nobody talked about steel.
This dude can write, y'all. We gonna get into this. Okay. So I'm gonna start with some background questions. Who are you?
I'm still trying to figure that out. I mean, I'm a writer for sure. That I come to through family. You know, like I don't come from a family of professional writers, but everybody in my family always, you know, has written. My mom used to keep notepads, those old school like black and white notepads, and they would be like, you know, bills, and her doing calculations of like budgets, and then like poetry, and then like, you know, a letter to my grandmother, and then more budgets, and then more poetry. So that's like a part of where I come from, and it's a part of just how I get by. You know, I'm a writer. And also I'm very black. Like I absolutely love being a black person. Like I love black culture. I love being in community with black people. And that's also at the core, I would say, of who I am. So I'm a black writer.
Yes. You wrote in your dedication, I guess I'm so confused. You wrote in your dedication for the misunderstood, the marginalized, and the maligned. What does that mean, and like what inspired just the writing of this book and this undertaking?
Yeah, in putting this book together, of course there's a way of like just writing about any topic, but I think what hopefully makes it meaningful to people is that I'm writing to a specific audience, and that audience is people who grew up like me, feeling left out of the official stories. So, you know, I watched a lot of TV, a lot of news growing up, and they talked about my neighborhood and talked about people like me, but never in the terms that I recognized, right? So, you know, when they wrote about drug dealers and demonized them, you know, some of that was true, the violence of it was true, but they didn't capture how funny my cousin Tony was, for example, who happened to be a drug dealer. He also was hilarious. And, you know, for me, that's why I write, is to complicate what people think they understand, and especially about people like me and communities like mine. So I dedicated the book to the misunderstood, the marginalized, and the maligned, because that's what I'm writing for.
You also had two Morrison. You had a Toni Morrison quote and a Du Bois quote. You know, also known as Du Bois. Depends on how you say things. Can I or can you read those quotes and tell us why you included those quotes?
Yeah.
Do you want me to read them or can you read them?
You can read them. Okay. So you really can't be a writer from Ohio and not love Toni Morrison.
That's correct.
But really just a reader and not love Toni Morrison. But, you know, her example is so strong. And the quote that I included in my dedication is from her Nobel lecture, where she writes, "Passion is never enough, neither is skill, but try. For our sake and yours, forget your name in the street. Tell us what the world has been to you in the dark places and the light. Don't tell us what to believe, what to fear. Show us belief's wide skirt, and the stitch that unravels fear's call. And then I have below that a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, where he wrote, "Beneath the veil lay right and wrong, vengeance and love, and sometimes throwing aside the veil, a soul of sweet beauty and truth still revealed." And those two things work for me in tandem because they are instructions on how to write. You know that what Toni Morrison is saying is, forget everything that you think has to go into this, and even forget who you are, and just try to tell the truth. And you know, going to journalism school, I've had some really great editors, but that maybe is like the best advice that I have on writing. And what Du Bois says then after that is, after you do all of that, we'll actually have something useful. You know, some actual information about the world that people can use to navigate things, you know, instead of all the misinformation and lies and slander that we tend to get.
Those quotes seem particularly important in what feels like a crazy time. And I know we have some writers in the room and some folks that may need some inspiration. So I really appreciate you speaking to, I had never seen two quotes, first and foremost. And there's so much about the writing of the book itself that I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to talk about. Before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about like your training for this work. So we heard that you're a Morehouse brother, a Morehouse man, and you studied psychology. You've also been in a number of esteemed fellowships, Demos, Soros. If y'all don't know, y'all should look them up because they have they're doing a lot of things to help get our work out there.
They got some money.
They got some money. They like the money. And then you also talked about identity psychology. And so I was curious if you could just tell us what that is. Like, what is identity psychology? And then how did it influence both you and shape you as a writer and thinker?
So yeah, my training really started at Morehouse. That I was, I went to Morehouse thinking that I was going to go to law school because they tell every smart black boy to become a lawyer. You know, like, you should be a lawyer. So then I thought that I should be a lawyer, and that was what I was pursuing. But I got really lucky really blessed that I just fell in love with the school paper while I was at Morehouse, and I fell in love with being able to write about Sean was actually there. You know, Sean mentioned that we were Morehouse brothers, but we were on the campus at the same time. I didn't have to write anything bad about Sean, but I wrote lots of bad things about his friends. And yeah, like I just fell in love with the process and started to really take it seriously. And I was a underground psych major, and I worked in a lab, the Identity Orchestration Research Lab, which is headed up by a mentor of mine, Dr. David Wall Rice, who he just studies at Morehouse how black men build and maintain our identities. And talks about identity as something that's not static. You know, that like who you are is a piece of sort of what you bring to it, what the world puts on you, and then you navigate that throughout your entire life, and it changes, right? So, you know, you asked me earlier who I was. That has changed over time. And, you know, I am an Ohioan. And I feel very Ohio when I'm outside of Ohio. And people are being just weird. And I'm like, y'all are weird. Like, this is a lot. But then also when I come back, you know, it's like there are things that, like we were driving around yesterday and I saw Donato's Pizza. And I was like, oh man, I need some Donato's.
Columbus people love Donato's.
We love Donato's.
You love Donato's.
Best pizza in the world. I mean, really, I lived in New York. I've been in Chicago. Donato's is the best pizza, if you let me tell you.
The Youngstown people gotta keep going. Keep going.
You got y'all's own thing? Okay. So yeah, so what Dr. Rice taught me is that, you know, identity is complex, and that we're always navigating. Even something like racial identity is also very complex. So I'm blessed that that was my major because I was able then to bring that into my writing in a way that I probably wouldn't have been able to if I had been an English major or had studied journalism. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the book and its writing and just how you wrote this incredible book that you describe as linking together so much existing knowledge and understanding. And one of the things that as I was reading really jumped out at me is that you wrote so honestly, but also compassionately, right? I think we've already started to talk about, that people don't understand that our drug dealer cousin Jordan is a human still, and I think Brian Stevenson reminds us that every person is better than the worst thing they've ever done. But I think it's hard to live that and act that, and I felt that while reading. And you told people, like, human being stories so brilliantly. So, like, how'd you do it? I'm curious about, like, how you do all that, like, how you're taking so much research, and especially in a field and around a topic where there's, like, not a lot written already, which I think we talked about was part of why you did it. But there was just other things that I noticed, especially in the second reading. You have a 34-page bibliography, and for us geeks, like, that's a lot of bibliography, And you noted that you were researching the book for 5 years, and we only hear that in, like, the seminal works, like Warmth of Other Suns. We hear how long Isabel Wilkerson worked on the book, and so, like, can you talk to us about your approach, and also particularly your approach to, like, research?
Yeah.
Right, because you want to be honest and factual and maintain integrity. So tell us a little bit about that.
That's a really good question, and I kind of understand now that this book is my protest against journalism as it was being forced on me. That I fell in love with journalism at Morehouse, and then I said, okay, well, I got to find a way to make money doing this. When you grow up poor like I did, that's the first thing that comes to mind is, like, you got to make money doing it. Yeah. So figure it out. So then I went to Columbia, and that was a way of getting that credential that would make it so that I could do serious work. But they tried to take away so much of my natural storytelling, and really succeeded for a long time. When you go through programs like that are to institutionalize you, really, like, I wanted to be able to make money, but I didn't understand that the flip side of it is working within and for an industry as it exists. So I was learning how to do what had already been done, which was something that I didn't really like, So I spent really a decade working as a journalist at a bunch of different places and having editors tell me that I didn't know how to write, didn't know how to tell stories, and listening to them. But then getting to a place where I thought, well, if y'all are so good at telling stories, and how come y'all haven't gotten this right in all of this time, right? And then sort of coming to the realization that what I needed to do was to return to the storytelling practices that made me. That, as Black people especially, really any marginalized group, the only reason that you have a history is because you come from good storytellers. Because that's who keeps the history. So I had to lean into those little notes that my mom made, or my cousin Tony's jokes as great jokester. I love phrases like "quiet as it's kept," because that is an anchor of Black storytelling. That somebody can say all of this prologue, right, and they can be telling you a story about this is happening, and they say, quiet as it's kept. And you sit forward a little bit, right? You like, what was kept so quiet? Because also happens to be the opening words of Toni Morrison's first book, Beloved. are the words quiet as it's kept. So it's a declaration of, I want to tell you a certain type of story in a certain kind of way. So I had to return to all of that. And the book really kind of, it just flowed from me once I gave myself permission to tell the story the way that I would tell it to anybody. You know, like not, writing it up for this big publisher or for whoever, but I wanted to write the story for my mom, for my neighbors. Even in the middle of the process, I shifted from using they. So, when you read journalism, and it could be any kind of journalist writing about a community, they'll say, they did this, they did that. But I'm writing about my community. And it didn't feel right. It was rubbing me the wrong way. So when you read the book and I'm talking about black people, you're reading we. We. And it was a big fight with my publisher. You didn't ask me this, but...
No, we want all this too.
It was a big fight with my publisher because my publisher said, well, this is going to push away a lot of readers. Because when they read your book, they'll say, well, why are you saying we when you're talking about poor black people? And they could be, a well-to-do white person. And I had to ask my editor, well, if I'm writing for the well-to-do white person, then maybe the black reader is feeling pushed away when I say that. And wondering, why is this black man writing about they? Ain't he supposed to be?
Exactly, yes.
So, to answer your question, yes, I had to just lean into the kind of ways that we always tell stories. Yeah.
So long story short, okay. So
or I ain't gonna hold you.
I ain't gonna hold you, but we gonna hold y'all for a while. If you gotta go, you gotta go. Okay. You kind of mentioned the ancestors and the acknowledgments again, and you thank the ancestors, and you say the book wouldn't exist without the work of some notable people. And I just wanted to name, you name Isabel Wilkerson and Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones and James Foreman. You just go kind of on, and John Singleton and Spike Lee and Bruce D. Johnson and Julius Wilson and Jay-Z and Notorious B.I.G., Tupac, Dr. Dre, Kendrick, W.E. Du Bois. Thank you all for your contributions and examples. Why was that important? Like, why was that an important acknowledgement, and how did those people influence this work?
Because I think that way too many people take credit for work that they didn't do. And being, especially journalists, that really we are just conduits for other people's stories and for information that just exists. So, I'm just the scribe, but I've been so influenced and really inspired by all of the writers and the scribes that came before me. And I am continuing on and building upon their ideas and their language. And I don't want people that read the book to think that I just plopped out of nowhere, with these fully formed ideas. That when I write about the marginalized and the maligned, I'm talking about the voices at the bottom of the well. That I'm talking about communities that have been written about by people far smarter than me 50, 100 years ago. And especially for black folks, we're often talking about the same issues over centuries. So this is just my presentation of really an argument that we've been trying to make for a long time about our experience in this country. And I'm presenting that argument through this era. And the argument is we are human. And on our best days, we are manifestations of God's grace and beauty. And we have to also lift that up, so that's the argument. And so this book is, this happened to us because we're human and we're vulnerable to drug epidemics like anybody else, but we survived it because we have a touch of the divine in us. So we didn't get any help and we survived it anyway. Y'all see why? Y'all see what I'm talking about? Okay.
Kind of related, you note the community of people. I thought this was really powerful. You noted the community of people who value your voice, as well as conversations and critiques. Why is that important?
Oh, in the acknowledgments. Yeah, because I believe so deeply in community, and especially for, I mean, you know, like this space is a testament to community. And, you know, we can't do anything big by ourselves.
That's right.
You know, that the African proverb is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So when I think of this book and the fact that it's a thing in the world now, this is because of my ancestors. It's because, of course, a lot of hard work for me, but also a whole community of people who like want me to win. And, you know, on my worst day, we're like, keep on going. Yeah, you know, like take like 24 hours to feel bad about yourself because you can't figure out a paragraph, and then tomorrow I'll get back to work. And, you know, also being a kid in a neighborhood like mine, I understand that that there were a lot of other really smart black boys too, and black girls too. But there were a limited number of seats.
Right.
And I'm able to be where I am because at really every juncture, I was able to move forward in that game of musical chairs. So I'm so thankful for the opportunities, and I feel so indebted to my community because I was extended opportunities that they didn't have to extend to me. You know, like I didn't come with no privilege. They didn't get anything back for helping me, but they did.
Right.
So, you know, I had to honor them in the book.
2 more questions on this section. You talk also at the end. Some y'all don't know this, but I have a when I read things, sometimes I have to read it from the back forward. Anybody else like that? Nobody? Am I the only reader? They like, no, bro, that's just you. That's weird. So just noting that I'm spending a lot of time on the end. Okay. You talk also about how the story was trying to kill you, and that you were experiencing what I read as a tremendous amount of hardship. Writing the book. What was going on?
Writing this book was hard. And I have written a lot, and I've always covered, you know, like tough stuff. Like there was like a 5-year period where I only wrote about criminal justice. So that was policing, that was prisons, that was incarceration. It was people being released and like reentry. So like I've seen some tough stuff, but it was because I was writing about stuff that I had also seen and experienced personally that it brought up a lot of grief that I didn't know I was still carrying. You know, that I thought that I had gotten past, you know, some of the stuff that I witnessed. But when you're talking to people and interviewing them for years about really some of the worst stuff that ever happened to them, it takes a toll on you. So, you know, when I got to, and also I finished it during the pandemic, so I was like holed up in an apartment in Atlanta with the thoughts and the stories and the audio, and you know, started getting heart palpitations. I lost like mad weight. I gained it back, but which is a good thing. Panic attacks. Because all of these thoughts about what happened during that period, I just couldn't get out of my head. So writing the book was like an exercise in just like getting that out. And but it's not all traumatic though, right? Like the book is ultimately a story of survival. So it covers the history of the crack epidemic, starting in the pre-crack era, going all the way until today. And it tells that story, but it also tells the stories of 4 people who survived it. And you meet them at the top of the book, all alive and intact and thriving in many cases. And then you figure out, you know, what those origin stories were. And so it was hard to get through the middle of the book, but once I got to the end, it was like,
Yeah.
okay, you know, we made it.
Yeah.
And that's the feeling that I want people to have after they read it, is like, okay, like I'm like exercising some like demons here, and I'm like bringing some stuff up, but we made it.
We're gonna meet those, I don't know, do I need this stuff? We're gonna meet those protagonists in just a moment. I had one more question just about the writing, which I think is important for us to hear from Black authors, like the writing of the thing. But I wanted you to tell us a little bit about, you noted the type at the end of the book, which I had never seen. And I thought was interesting. And I also was wondering if you could explain the cover art.
Yeah. So I really had to fight for this cover, y'all. And also, I mean, I'm a little bit of like a control freak, you know, and it is kind of like, I think, a response to like trauma and Reddit, is that you try to be as on top of things as possible. So, because, you know, Lord forbid something not be good,
Yeah.
and I didn't try.
Yeah.
So my thing is, it can be bad and it cannot turn out well, but if I gave it my best, then like, I'm good. If I didn't give it my best, I'll be salty for the rest of my life. So because this was my first book, I was like, they're not gonna like me at this publisher, but they just have to not like it. So the typeset that we settled on, it's a mix of two. So the typeset for When Crack Was King, for the title, is actually ripped from a lot of anti-drug ads, like print ads at the time. So, and it is also crack white, so it's like an off-white. That was like an intentional choice. And the second typeface is Courier, which is the sort of a standard typeface of like government memos and documents. So I wanted people to, one, see the book as official, right? That it was like that, like this history is as official as anything the government told you about crack.
Yeah.
It's actually more official, because that means, you know.
There you go.
And in terms of the cover art, I didn't want to show the drug itself or some devastating picture of the time, because the way that I experienced the crack epidemic was those events and those incidents were interruptions in our lives. That we were still people in communities living lives, you know, falling in love, falling out of love, birthdays, you know, riding your first bike, all of that. But then these things would happen, right? And then that were interrupting the normal flow of life. So I wanted to have a picture of a young man like me during this era, just living life and looking out over his neighborhood. And when you look at it, you're looking at this city, you can imagine everything going on in that city, but that's not the center of what is happening there.
Thank you. Okay, let's talk about the protagonist. Mordecai helped me with that one. I was like, are they characters? Like, how do I even describe this? The protagonist, and you already read about one, Michelle, the crackhead from down the street who loved Patti LaBelle. I found it. You know, these other folks that you grew up with, you saw growing up. And I think there was something that you noted early on that I think so many of us can resonate with, that you made it out relatively unscathed, but not untouched. And I want to continue to talk about that. But can you introduce us to these protagonists, and also talk about why these folks, how you found them, and not Freeway Ricky Ross, you know, a book about Freeway Ricky Ross or Bumpy Johnson or something like that.
Right.
Who are these people and why them?
So the book chronicles the lives of 4 protagonists. I call them characters sometimes.
I can call them characters?
Yeah,
Okay.
characters.
Okay.
And it's their lives before, during, and after their experiences with crack. And one is a woman named Lenny Woodley, who was an addict in South Central LA for almost about 30 years. A guy named Elgin Swift, whose father, he's out of Yonkers, New His father was an addict for most of his life. He grew up in a crack house. A guy named Sean McCray, who was a basketball prodigy, who was also a drug dealer for much of his youth, out of Newark, New Jersey, the Hayes Homes projects. And then a guy named Kurt Schmoke, who was the mayor of Baltimore during the crack epidemic. And I picked them because I wanted to have different perspectives of it. You know, it couldn't, like, I didn't want to focus just on crack as it was experienced by dealers or by users. It had to be a mix. And I wanted people in different cities around the country, because every epidemic was different. That you can't tell the story and say Ohio by what was going on in South Central Los Angeles, or what was going on in New York. And I arrived at those characters through a really long process that started in 2018, where I traveled to the 10 hardest hit cities, and just over the course of a year and a half, I interviewed people in New York, and in Newark, and in Chicago, and in Detroit, and in South Central and Oakland. And I made a lot of friends that I wouldn't expect I would become friends with. And those four were just willing to tell me their stories and to open up in a way that it was like, I love these people. You know, like I can't not put them in the book. So that's how I arrived at those four.
What did you learn from them?
The biggest thing that I learned is that we are much stronger than we know. That all of them are real survivors who went through some incredible stuff, and they found a way through it, and they're not bitter about it. That's kind of like the remarkable thing, is that they're like, man, I have lived a life, and they're willing to tell you if you would just listen. So that was a big thing, and also I learned from them how important it is to tell our stories, because there are lessons that other people can learn from what we've been through, but you know, we got to wade through a lot of shame and trauma in order to, and also just, you know, people don't feel like they have a story to tell. You know, that was a big thing that I would find, you know, just as a journalist, especially when I was doing street and crime reporting, is I would see somebody that was there, that saw the whole thing, as they say, and then you would say, you know, can I talk to you? And they would go, oh man, you know, I got nothing to say.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you're the expert. You are the person that was here. Like, let me hear from you. And so everybody is an expert in something, and everybody has a story to tell. It's just about locating your expertise and being vulnerable enough to share.
You noted that it was hard to, or that you had some trepidation about including Elgin, who is a white guy from Yonkers. Why was that?
Yeah, well, you know, because the story is about how, it's really at its heart a story about how black people survived the crack epidemic. And so Elgin was like, you're just not black, right? Like, I don't want to put you in this book. But what I learned from Elgin, and the reason why he's in the book, is that Elgin grew up in a black neighborhood, and he lost his mother when he was 1, and he was raised by his dad, and he was a part of the community. He even, he was telling me about, you know, the way that he was styled, that it took him until he was maybe about 6 or 7 to know that he was white, because everybody in the neighborhood thought that he was Puerto Rican. Yeah. And like nobody ever pulled him aside to say, Elgin, you are white. You know? But like those were just his influence, and that was his culture. And I learned from Elgin that crack and its consequences were so big back then that it actually didn't matter what your race was, that like it could touch somebody in white skin too, right? That he didn't have the complexion for protection, you know, in that scenario. And so you can look at the book and actually see crack's scale by what it also did to Elgin.
So let's talk about kind of the scale and many of our introductions to crack, and it is why we wanted to have an opportunity for some interactivity, because we all have a story, especially those of us that grew up in these urban centers. in our introduction to crap, you noted that you talked about the residue it left on everything it touched, which is powerful. But I wanted to go back to something that you noted kind of in our introduction, that your mother told you about minding your business. And my mother is here, and she always told me to mind my business. I ain't see her and her friends minding their business, but that's what we got told.
They were in everybody's business.
They was in everybody's business. But you also you read this that this notion of minding your business was like growing up in a steel town where nobody talked about steel. And that resonated so much coming from Youngstown, right? Because all you ever heard about growing up was what Youngstown used to be, what this street used to look like, what this thing used to be like. And again, as an 80s, 90s kid, it was like what it used to be and just this enormity of this thing that's kind of terrifying everybody in one way or another. So say more about this minding your business. Like what?
I mean, it's just a part of who we are culturally, right? Which is that, like, the way that you protect yourself in when you can't change your circumstances is you keep your head down and you push through. And you just try to stay out of trouble by minding your business. And it's a great survival technique, right? But, like, you don't learn a lot about why things are happening and how they're happening when your approach is just to be like, I don't know what's going on over there. And for kids, you know, you're naturally curious and you're going to have questions. So, you know, we have, like, I have, you know, aunts and uncles that we just didn't talk to for a decade, and nobody said why. You know what I mean? And you know, and sadly they passed away before I took on this project. So, you know, a part of me doing this was to learn a little bit about my, you know, family and addiction and how that works within family units and the consequences of it. You know, mind your business is a great policy up to a certain point, and that's because all of it is our business. Yeah, you know that, like, what goes on in your community is your business. Right. And it doesn't mean that you run up on the dope boys on the corner and say, hey, what you doing? You know, but you should have some sense of what's going on. So
you was right, Mom. We was allowed to be in people's business. I wanted to talk about just kind of the history, the evolution, the criminalization. You talked about, and this is just a little preview for when y'all read the book. You talked about you go back as far as talking about the indigenous people chewing on coca leaves. You noted how Inca slaves were given this drug for energy and endurance. How when this drug is going to Europe and the chemical compounds are being isolated, and a big fan is Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud loved cocaine. Did y'all know that?
Little known fact.
Sigmund Freud loved cocaine. 1886, 9 milliliters. I don't know. You know, I always mess up you don't know, but I know. I always mess up. But of actual cocaine and Coca-Cola. These non-medical uses, I was really, really struck by you talking about the notion that Black laborers, when given this drug, were stronger, impervious to heat and cold. And then you told these stories just about, I think, what we feel and understand so much today around the ways that media and these narratives stoke white fear and hysteria. You told some stories about 1901 Atlanta, 1906, which happens to be, for those that don't know, the year that the first Black fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity was incorporated. The same year that there was a so-called raping spree of white women, and then the mob destruction and terror that comes from this. And I remember reading that thinking, like, how have I never heard this story when so many Black people were terrorized and lost their lives, and just the descriptions of us as Black brutes, and that cocaine is making Black men and rape white women, and You noted the cocaine-crazed Negro brain and the new Southern menace, right? Like, but just that these narratives started kind of a long time ago. Why was it important to kind of ground in that history?
You know, I'm just a nerd, right? So like, before I can write about something like the crack epidemic, I have to understand all the elements. That's sort of how I build it in my mind, is that, you know, I have to know what the drug is, I have to know its history, how it actually impacts a person's body and physiology before I then can even write about, you know, what was going on in the 80s. So what I learned in the book is that, like, cocaine has a really long history going back to the Andes in South America, the mountainous region in South America where coca leaves grow. And the history, really as far back as there have been people in the Andes, the Incas, is that they would chew the leaves. And they chewed the leaves and they got like a little boost of energy, and they would carry, you know, a handful of leaves with them as they climbed and as they did work. Well, when the Spanish conquistadors came, they saw that this is a practice that they had, and they were like, oh, okay, it's kind of interesting, you know, it's the devil. And then when they saw that they worked harder, when they had the leaves, they were like, it's not the devil. We can actually provide you all with this as we colonize your land and put you to work. So in much of South America, as it was being colonized, it was not unusual to see the Spanish providing these indigenous slaves, really, with cocaine. And then it made its way to Europe, and they studied how to actually isolate the base of this compound. That's how you got powder cocaine from coca leaves. And Freud, who you mentioned, wrote lots of papers about the wonders of cocaine. So there was a period in the early 1900s where cocaine was being put in everything as like a tonic, including Coca-Cola, which still to this day has a trace amount of coca leaf extract. It's not enough to get you high, but there is technically, you know, coca leaf still in Coca-Cola. And this period that you described in 1906 in Atlanta was the Atlanta race riots. And it was rumored in Atlanta that the bars along Auburn Avenue were selling cocaine-laced drinks, and that these drinks were getting black men amped up to rape white women, was the story. So there were stories published in the Atlanta Journal and the Atlanta Constitution one day, and mobs formed in downtown Atlanta, and they destroyed the corridor of black businesses there and killed people. So the history of associating black people with this substance, imagining that black people become monsters when given this substance, goes back really, really far. So it should not be surprising then when cocaine reemerges as crack and black people start to use it at disproportionate rates in the 80s and 90s, that those same tropes, right? That, you know, Public Enemy called it Night of the Living Baseheads, and they would talk about crack addicts as zombies or as monsters. It's also important to note that anywhere where you have people doing hard work for long hours, you're going to also get substance abuse. So whether it's Wall Street, where they do a lot of cocaine, athletes, you know, that there's a history. I mean, you know, cocaine is a stimulant. It gives you energy. Almost every office place that you go to will provide you with one thing for free. And it's a stimulant that gives you energy, right? And so we got to think about our relationship to substances. And it goes beyond just the things that we call drugs that are scary, that we can have a complicated relationship to lots of different substances, but the history between black folks and cocaine is complicated.
I'm going to come back to the question that we talked about last night. We said we couldn't talk about, we're going to talk about it here. But so can you talk about then, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and come back. Sips a little bit of coffee with no sugar. No sugar. Just what's the difference? Because we know that that in the early 1900s, like there's mass consumption of marijuana and heroin, and So what is different about these eras from your research?
So, the crack epidemic was such a big deal. It wasn't America's first drug epidemic, that we've had crazes around alcohol where we prohibited alcohol in this country. And we still, one of the sort of random consequences of that is America is much more of this is just like a small aside, much more of a beer culture than a wine culture because of prohibition. That in Europe, where you could actually have a vineyard, right, people were able to get really into wine, but Americans are more into beer and something like corn liquor because you can grow something like wheat and not get the suspicion of like officials. So that's like just one result, right, of like our like weird relationship to substances. So what's different about crack is that powder cocaine went through a process that I discovered. It was from Bay Area college students that started to experiment with powder cocaine in the 70s. Free love, everybody's high and partying, and they want to experiment with ways of consuming cocaine in a different way. And they want to smoke cocaine because anything that you smoke goes to your brain immediately. It's a more intense high, but it's more short-lived. So these chemistry students figure out that you can free the base of this compound through a chemical process that I won't describe. And that's how cocaine gets its how crack gets its original name, which was freebase. It comes from the chemistry term freeing the base of the compound from other elements. So that made it cheap. It also made it something that people binged because they wouldn't get high from cocaine and stay high for a long time. They had to use a lot of it. And that pattern of use changed people's lives because it meant that surge to get high became the only thing that many of them cared about. And that was different than it was with other drugs where people, might use something like heroin. They would get high, stay high, fall asleep. That's not uncommon with heroin or other opioids. Crack was completely different. People got high and they got energy, and they wanted more crack. So it made it a very intense epidemic. It also came around at a time where people were losing jobs. We had deindustrialization in this country, so places like many of our neighborhoods in Ohio where people were guaranteed almost a great job out of high school, it was harder and harder to get those jobs. So a lot of people that would have otherwise been working in factories became drug dealers. And anytime you have a bunch of young men involved in anything, it gets violent very quickly. So the crack epidemic was marked by very intense drug use from the people that were using it, but also very intense drug trade that was often violent. So when we think about the trauma of the crack epidemic, it's not just about the drug use, it's the violence that accompanied it. And then also I would say the third layer, which is the policing and the policies that came that then disrupted communities, put people in jail for really long periods of time for possession. All of those things made it different.
I think that was one of the things in the book that was most devastating. I think it was like a reckoning with my childhood, that it wasn't just bad people doing a bad thing, but there was perhaps this conspiracy. And some of us have heard that, about the conspiracy. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about the timeline as one layer, this kind of post-civil rights America, this emerging new black middle class. You have a beautiful couple paragraphs about the song Ain't No Stopping Us Now, which I was like, oh, I never kind of considered this, just black buoyancy, flourishing and languishing, but also the tension that it creates within the black community, right, with those that are like getting out and those that are staying. And you described it as the perfect drug for the times, and that it was a stimulant, give you confidence, energize you, it was serene, and that we were both celebrating and fighting, right, in these times, and that crack was dashing Black hope and progress. So can you talk more about like what's happening in this period, both from a timeline perspective, but perhaps what it's in response to? You know what question is coming after that?
Yeah, it was really important for me to understand what the Black community was like before crack, because like you, I'm a millennial. Crack predates me. So when people would, like in my family, would talk about what our neighborhood was like, I was like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Can't picture it, yeah.
So the research though was like, there was a lot of promise in Black communities, like the one that I grew up in the 70s, in the 80s, and even in the 60s before that. In that, again, these were neighborhoods that people were able to buy homes in because they had good jobs, benefits, and could retire. And that when those opportunities went away, what had been solidly working class neighborhoods became ghettos essentially, right? Where you have like a generation of people who can't pick up where their parents left off. And they're turning to drugs to get high, but also to make money. So, I was obsessed with Ain't No Stopping Us Now by McFadden and Whitehead because it kind of encapsulates the period after the civil rights movement where opportunities were just opening up. And there was this promise of, you can make it in America, but then very quickly the opportunity shut down. And as a result, I think a lot of people were left, at least from what from my interviewing, a lot of people were left with this feeling that maybe it was them, that maybe they were doing something wrong, and that's why they hadn't made it in America yet. And what do you do with that feeling? If everything around you in the culture is telling you that you should be doing better, but there's no way for you to actually do better, right? That you want to check out. And we see that again today when we talk about the opioid epidemic and people's levels of disaffection and disenfranchisement and how they feel hopeless, right? And don't know how they're going to pay their bills or, when things will change. That's true now for lots of people, and it was actually true for us back then. So, I write in the book about that period of hope that's quickly dashed and how crack comes at just that moment.
So the question I had asked Donovan last night when we were chatting about this incredible work was, I was wondering if you were positing that the government, this conspiracy that so many of us feel and believe, I was asking you, are you positing that the government pushed crack into the hood in direct response to Black progress? And I thought that our dialogue about that was really profound, but as I continued reading again today, I just wanted to read a quick paragraph, and this was in the chapter on the conspiracy, right? So from 1980 to 1998, and this is at the very end. But you write that a smoking gun has yet to emerge, proving a government conspiracy to poison communities of color using crack. But what the evidence supports is more insidious. The crack epidemic was the consequence of the anti-Blackness that permeated and continues to permeate every facet of American society and public policy. Reagan, the CIA, the cartels, and the Contra had no need to conspire because the entire machinery of the United States was designed either to our detriment or with no regard for us at all. The crack epidemic was not the product of an anti-Black conspiracy, but the product of an anti-Black system. So you had answered my question.
That was beautifully written.
It was beautifully written.
I did my thing on that. Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, you know what? I mean, because that was a big question that I had, right? It was like, if I look into this, what am I going to find? You're trying to get me taken out by the CIA. I
just want you to hear your writing again.
I mean, something that I know right, is that when America gets a cold, Black America gets the flu.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that in everything from, natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina.
Mm-hmm.
You saw it in the pandemic,
mm-hmm.
right, where we were hit first and worst.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens time and time again.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was also the case with crack,
mm-hmm.
that we were hit first and we were hit worst. Now, we weren't the only people hit,
mm-hmm.
But it really was so disruptive for Black communities. And I think that I didn't find any evidence that was intentional.
Mm-hmm.
I did find evidence that it was known to the government that tons and tons of cocaine were being shipped into the United States, and that instead of disrupting the flow of drugs into the United States, they chose to criminalize the people that ended up with the drugs, right? And that is a choice, that's a policy choice. They didn't design it, they weren't the ones that were actually dropping it off in Black neighborhoods, but that they took advantage of this moment of chaos and created a system of mass incarceration that we're still dealing with today. Which is not what ended the epidemic. It actually, in many cases, made it worse. So to answer your question, no, I didn't find any evidence that there was a plan, but I do think that when it happened, the government did everything that it could to make it worse on Black people, to be honest. Yeah.
You talked about how you kind of, in your choice of writing, talk through these people's stories, and then arrived at this point. There's some chapters towards the end, again, for those of us that live this, that are infuriating, right? Where you go into detail about the Iran-Contra affair, the Kerry Committee. So this is John Kerry sanctioned this committee. There's this whole section on this dark alliance, which I had not heard of. And really this government cover up that whether again there was a plan and it's it's so intentional, it impacted our lives and our community, and in many ways our future so much. So I really encourage folks. That was where I was most infuriated in reading the book. But I think that again the way that you end that chapter about there not needing to be there's no need for a smoking gun was really beautifully done and beautifully written. So how did it end? And particularly what I'm interested in here is in the interest of time, because I know folks might have some questions, so I don't want to hog all of our time, but you noted where kids were. You talked a lot about pop culture, particularly music and film. You talked about Dr. Dre and the Chronic, which, some of us, when our mama stopped breaking our CDs, those were some of the few that made it. But that, so how did it, and you also talked importantly about the community, which you detail how we get that wrong. Oh, okay. What was going on? Okay. So how did it end, and what role did those actors play?
First, I am very sorry that your CDs were being broken.
So many.
But I had a very similar experience. I had a copy of DMX's It's Dark and Hell is Hot.
Yeah.
Where he's covered in the blood in the bathtub, and my mom
was like, "What is this?"
It was an immediate no. It was an immediate no.
No.
But
that was Lil' Kim for me. She was like, "What? Why this girl got her legs over like this?" Yeah. Okay. Y'all remember that CD? Ooh.
But you know what? What the research showed, right? There's all these great studies that were done by the U.S. Department of Justice that tried to answer the question, why did the crack epidemic end? And what they ultimately came to is that it was the choices of young people to not use and sell drugs. It was the next cohort of young Black and Latino people who looked at the devastation in their neighborhood and said, I don't want any part of it. And that's something that I feel like we need to lift up.
Yeah.
Because we don't always give young people enough credit for making good choices. But that's what ended it, because drug epidemics are trends. So whether it's bell bottoms or pet rocks, that it only continues to be popular if the next cohort of people pick it up.
Right.
and young people didn't want to pick up crack. A big thing that they point to in those studies is the impact of not Nancy Reagan and Just Say No, or the DARE program, but the actual media that we were consuming, whether it was movies like, I remember watching New Jack City and Chris Rock's character, Pookie. And I was like, I don't want that to be me, Or watching Spike Lee's Jungle Fever and Samuel Jackson's character Gator when he steals his mom's color TV. Terrifying, right? So it's media like that, but it's also, surprisingly, within hip-hop, there's this litany of anti-crack music. And Dr. Dre's so interesting with all of his issues. You know what I mean? Like, we won't talk about Dr. Dre and women right now, because that's something unto itself. But as it relates to drugs, even going back with NWA, songs like Dope Man, or what's so interesting is that when you actually graph the rise and fall of the crack epidemic in most cities, it starts to really take off around 1982. Sorry. It hits a peak around 87 and continues to kind of like stay up there until about 1992, and then it just completely drops off. In 1992, you see then young people, instead of using cocaine and other hard drugs, marijuana use skyrockets in 1992. So what that means is that young people, when they were starting to use drugs, were saying no to crack and saying yes to weed. 1992 happens to be the year that Dr. Dre dropped the Chronic. So, he got a lot of flack at the time for glamorizing drug use, but it was a specific drug that, lots of folks make lots of money selling legally today, which we can get into, as well. But, it's an interesting fact about how culture can actually work to change dynamics like that.
Yeah, we as we were talking about this, there's in the book, there's a chapter after crack, and I think that you talk about the recovery and the progress that we've made, Black Lives Matter, the Obama Fair Sentencing Act, kind of signaling a drawdown on this war on drugs, because you kind of can't talk about the crack era without talking about the war on drugs, and we would need at least another hour. But those policy decisions, by extension, those practice decisions, have had tremendous impact on millions and millions and millions of, for sure, Black and brown lives. But I think something that we talk about at ThirdSpace in our work around racial equity, that our inability to talk about these things and to talk about things like race really obscure the suffering of everybody, right? Like, this country was deeply impacted by this epidemic. But I wanted to ask, as I start to wrap up, so get ready with your questions, a couple things. I'm just curious about, like, what you believe the path forward looks like, action, and some of my questions there are like, how do we heal? Is there some sort of truth and reconciliation that is needed? I found myself throughout the book, reading the book, thinking about what we're owed. I feel like a big part really of my childhood was robbed by this epidemic, right? And not just that, I was in a community that was really really felt ravaged by crack, but that it turned us on each other. It made us demonize each other, tore our families apart in these ways that made us make these decisions about people that kept us distracted from what was happening structurally and systematically, right? And it was this guy, this gal's, this crackhead that's abandoning her babies. It was all on them. So I felt myself just thinking about, like, kind of what we're owed and then, like, what our roles are. But before you go there, you noted last night that there's some things that we can't talk about with Black folks. And I think that particularly you were talking about just like drug use and like these are conversations that are a little they hit my ears as third rail.
Yeah.
Why is that?
You know, this stuff is so touchy because we did survive it, that it's hard to want to take a look back.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't want to be associated with something as sort of scandalous as drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Like even the idea of writing this book, which is, I mean, for me it was like a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm.
Like no one had written an authoritative history of the crack epidemic
Mm-hmm.
yet. I'm a black journalist that writes about black people. Like, I should write that book. But people ask me all the time, why would you write a book about crack?
Mm-hmm.
As though like it's not a significant topic in the way that anything else is.
Mm-hmm.
That the crack epidemic was a period a little bit longer than a decade with major implications in our society and for a community that I'm a part of and care about. Why wouldn't I write a book about crack? You know? But what they're saying is this is so deeply shameful for people. Why take on something heavy like this? And I took it on because I think the only way past it is through it. And to answer your question about like next steps, that like we have to start telling our stories, breaking down those walls of shame and judgment, because substance abuse is a human thing. And I think that after we do that and we get right as a community and as a society, in understanding like why this happened to individuals but to communities and and all of that, that the next step is reparations. I think that reparations is the next step for everything. You ask me, you woke up this morning, what are you doing next? Reparations. That I think that people's lives were harmed in ways through incarceration, through families being broken up, through displacement from communities. And we got to start getting creative about how we can make up for that. Like I kind of alluded to earlier, the sort of legalization of marijuana in many places. That's an industry that black folks are still pushed out of because they have drug dealing convictions.
Right.
Well, who should be selling drugs besides a drug dealer? I mean, in my opinion, right? That we should have priority in getting into industries like that when they are legalized. When I think about neighborhoods that are gentrified today, what I see are neighborhoods that were hard hit by the crack epidemic that older people usually held on to. Right. That they're only gentrifiable because somebody's grandmother didn't sell her house. Right. And she held down the block. Right. And because there were businesses that held the neighborhood down. Well, how do we protect people's interest in those neighborhoods so that way it wasn't all for naught? That for me, that's a form of reparations. There was a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, despite them being the same substance. Under Obama's sentencing reform, that was reduced to 18-to-1. But why is there a disparity at all? Right. That disparity still exists. Let's try to eliminate that. So yeah, those are some like actionable next steps for me.
What do you recommend besides this book first? What else do you recommend that we read or watch or listen to kind of educate ourselves and I think relearn, unlearn, reimagine what has happened and the path forward?
I think that people should read Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. That was a book that really inspired me to write this book. It's the story of the great migration of black folks from southern cities to northern cities, like Cleveland. And for me, it was so beautiful because it is like a story that's like on like the tip of our tongues. Like if you're a black person from Ohio, you got some family in the South. And Isabel Wilkerson said, this is important enough to write about. So for me, I like to think that when Crack Was King picks up where The Warmth of Other Suns leaves off, because all those great migration cities became crack cities. But also I think that go back to the classics, go back to Clockers, Spike Lee's Clockers, to Jungle Fever, to Menace to Society, like the art that was being made at the time. There's some great books that kind of help to understand the dynamics under the crack epidemic like The Condemnation of Blackness by Khalil Gibran Muhammad, where he writes about the association between black people and criminality in this society, how we are seen as criminal just in our bodies. And he traces that history of law. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow goes into how mass incarceration was built during this period. Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly is fantastic. Jay-Z's Reasonable Doubt, which is made during the era. The Chronic. I'm a big fan of The Chronic, so listen to that. Yeah.
You're amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.